Our second speaker, Jan Skarbek-Kazanecki, is an assistant professor and PhD student at the Department of Classical Philology at the University of Łódź in Poland. His doctoral dissertation focuses on the concept of justice, dike, in the Corpus Theognideum. His paper today, the transmission of the Theognidean tradition as a mnemonic cultural practice, aims to determine how the oral tradition associated with the name of Theognis and retained in a collection called Corpus Theognideum has been stabilized through the text. So Jan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. Let me also thank the other organizers for having me, even though I truly regret the fact that I couldn't see Jerusalem with my own eyes. I am also truly grateful for the opportunity to present the results of my study among such distinguished researchers in front of the people who constitute the biography of my own PhD. So believe me, it is a wonderful experience. Let me share my presentation. Now, before I get started, I would mention that not wanting to take more time than foreseen, I had to limit my own material. So I apologize for any shortcuts or arbitrariness. I was hoping that my interpretation will be complemented by handouts. Unfortunately, I can't find it on the website of our conference. So if there is still a possibility, please put my handout on the website. Or if somebody would like to read it after my talk, please write me an email. Can you see my presentation? I hope so. Okay, so you can see that I'll be talking about the Corpus Theognidium, a collection of elegies attributed to Theognis of Megara, which has long given rise to the issue of its authenticity, namely the so-called Theognidian question. So I will return again from the broader framework outlined by Professor Deborah Beck to the issue of textual transmission in ancient times. As you may know, until the 80s, researchers tended to treat some textual anomalies and features which are difficult to explain from the perspective of the classical textual criticism or the analytical approach as the basis for the view that someone, an unknown copyist or a compiler, had used some testimonies and pieces of other elegiac traditions to create a new collection, subsequently assigned to the archaic poet Theognis. In recent years, however, as today Professor Massimo Giuseppetti showed, that's why I'm so glad to be speaking after him and that I can skip this thread. The modern emphasis on the context of oral communication and on the performative character of archaic Greek poetry enables philologists to approach this issue in a new light, treating various variations of a given elegy or repetitions that occur throughout the manuscripts of the corpus, not as scribal errors or traces of some kind of inferior branches of textual transmission, but rather as a reflection of a unique performative occasion, as an effect of sudden changes made to the songs to make them fit a given performance or each other. Simultaneously, the elegy as a key element of the aristocratic symposium came to be depicted in the context of communication as an important medium of rhetoric and ideology. Having totally absorbed these assumptions, I will try to define today, on the one hand, how the oral tradition preserved in the Corpus Theognidium, previously transmitted through reperformance, could have been stabilized through the text, through writing. On the other hand, I will return to the doubt already formulated by Joseph Kroll, who asked what ancient authorities, Vatican instances, would care about the survival of the Corpus Theognidium. As a starting point, I assume, following Luigi Rossi's observations, that the survival of a given poetic work in antiquity was strictly dependent on the patronage and protection of a selected institution, of some autorità ufficiale, istituzionale, or a social group which, for whatever reason, was particularly keen on its preservation. However, while the Italian scholar clearly separates the officially protected literature, la letteratura ufficialmente protetta, in the case of which the key role is played by political institutions and literature, which wasn't protected, mainly lost known through indirect sources. I will try to show that the boundary between what is institutional and non-institutional in the case of the transmission of archaic poetry could have been much more fluid. And this is demonstrated by the corpus Theognidium, that is, which I am reading as a testimony of tradition that from the beginning was largely dependent on unofficial practices linked to aristocratic movements and transmitted through aristocratic symposia, thus situated in clear opposition to the institutional order or the official democratic ideology of Polis. Before turning to the archaic age, I would like to stick for a moment to the 19th century Theognidian question, based on the assumptions that the corpus Theognidium is a compilation of various elegies. In the 19th century, researchers raised another doubt, this time not about the authenticity, but about the place and the scope of its uprising. Many were trying to prove that this book was intended in the original form for school purposes as a textbook created in the 4th or 3rd century BC. As evidence, they pointed to the testimonies of that time, clearly confirming the educational, or more broadly, the socializing rule ascribed to the tradition associated with the name of Theognis. In fact, in the classical era, Theognis was one of the ancient poets who were portrayed as sages, sophoi, and proto-philosophers whose sole motivation was to educate citizens by their way to politas, as we read, for example, about Simonides in one pseudo-Platonic dialogue. So Theognis was described as the best advisor, Aristos Symbolos, as Isocrates wrote, testimony presented on the slide. A poet who creates exclusively didactic poetry and moral teachings, advices, and who we will see it on the slide with the testimony of Xenophon, was writing about anything but virtue, arete, and the wickedness, kakia, of human beings. Let me note that the Isocrates fragment is also a textual evidence that some people did not care or did not pay attention to the old texts. Even Plato, known for his aversion to poets, make use of the Theognidian tradition. And even if Socrates and Meno readily accuses Theognis of inconsistency, the use of this tradition of Plato's dialogues testifies the fact that it belonged to the canon respected among aristocrats, towards which even Plato is very sympathetic. And now the testimonium of Xenophon. Yes, especially this testimony seems intriguing. It probably comes from Xenophon, who provides us with interesting information regarding the reception of Theognis. Note that the testimony attributed to him clearly inscribes the Theognidian tradition into political or ideological disputes specific to the classical era. The concept of polypragmosyne seems to be of particular importance here. As L.B. Carter showed in his famous Quiet Athenian, this term was one of the key slogans used in the disputes between pro-democrats and oligarchic circles at that time, a concept associated with the attitude of an active citizen of the Athenian democratic polis participating in community institutional practices. In opposition to it, the anti-democratic elites, which avoided active participation in Polish democracy, participation in government and civic affairs, were defining themselves through the concept of apragmosyne, as apragmonas, thus by the term which clearly emphasized the anti-political attitude. So the Xenophon's fragment, apart from the fact that it clearly confirms that the tradition known to us from the corpus Theognidium was available in a textual form already in the classical era, indicates also its ideological overtone. We see that aristocratic circles recognize the figure of Theognis as a legendary teacher and moral authority, and that they attributed special political and educational rule to it. Therefore, it seems plausible that the Theognis elegies in fact were used for school purposes. This is not the end of the story, however. This does not mean that in the 5th century, the relationship between the tradition and the symposium was not clear and essential for its reception. The fact that it was quite the opposite is assured, as noted by my compatriot Krystyna Bartol, by a fragment of the Ferocrates comedy titled Hieron, there as a part of a longer instruction on proper behavior at the symposium, 2 lines known to us from the Corpus Theognidium are invoked. Another truth, however, not very strong, we may find on the Attic Codex attributed to Duris, containing the inscription referring to verses known from the Corpus Theognidium. Finally, as Theodora Hadji-Mitchell notes, singing poetry is identified with the symposium as the setting of the performance still in late classical era. So it seems, therefore, that the Theognist tradition at that time could still be alive, I mean, transmitted orally through a symposic performance, or at least associated with the convention of the symposium, no less than with school activities. And this in turn directs our attention to the second theory of the creation of the Corpus Theognidium. As you may know, already in the 19th century, in opposition to the school theory, Richard August Reitzenstein, in his Epigrammum Scholium, claimed that originally it was a collection of sympathetic songs created probably in the 5th century for the aristocratic banquets. As an analogy, researchers pointed to another set of sympathetic pieces of poetry, songs called Attic Scholia, created at the turn of the 6th and 5th centuries. And although Reitzenstein's work lacks an unambiguous model of orality, he successfully pointed to a number of features of the Corpus Theognidium, which we can explain precisely through the model of oral communication. For example, the repetition of the same disgusts, usually in a slightly different form, the sequence structure of some elegies resembling some kind of musical dialogue, the so-called catena, sympathetic chains, and even the sudden turns from seriousness and solemnity to ironic pranks and jokes. Moreover, the entire collection, as well as the Attic Scholia, seems to correspond to the program and order of the sympathetic ceremony. However, also the model of sympathetic syllogism does not fully, of sympathetic collection, does not fully determine the character of the Corpus Theognidium. Doubts may arise, in particular, about the ambivalence of the tradition. I mean, the lack of references to a specific ceremony, as well as the size of the collection, which cannot be reduced to a single symposium or just a single act of dictation. Certainly, as we have seen, the Theognidian tradition functioned already in the 4th century as an independent, more or less standard-based and codified text accessible to a wider group of recipients. It should also be pointed out that during this period, the dynamically developing book culture in Athens ceased to be a marginal phenomenon. In addition, considering the transformations of the sympathetic formula and the gradual disappearance of the old banquet culture, it is easy to imagine, as Hendrik Zeller, for example, argues, that somewhere at the turn of the 5th and 4th centuries, there has been a chase for poetic traditions of the archaic era that were progressively less and less remembered, more difficult to access. So the process of canonization of the Theognidian tradition in the textual form could have taken place precisely in this context, somewhere in Greece, maybe in Megara, more probably in Athens, on the basis of few private sympathetic spomnemata, memoranda, rewritten and rearranged according to the needs and intuition of the users, adapted and suited in size to the needs, to the current standards of papyrus role, narratively structured, detached from specific performances and devoid of references to a particular performative occasion. Also opened with hymns to the gods in accordance with the convention also visible in the Attic Scholia. And finally, sealed with a programmatic elegy, which identifies the tradition with the Theognis name that we could see during the presentation of Teddy Fassberg. So simultaneously, this elegy, this elegiac tradition, Theognidian tradition, locked up in a textual form, could be used in various contexts and circumstances, either for private use or for school purposes. So the interpretation I propose links the formation and creation of the Corpus Theognidium with the circulation of private papyri and the bottom-up initiatives undertaken by people interested in learning or preserving the tradition of Theognis, or more broadly of the aristocratic sympathetic tradition. In this respect, it fits with the picture of Theognis, understood as a poetic persona. In many elegies, the poetic I presents itself as a banquet expelled from his polis. With the exception of several elegies, there's not so much an honored and recognized citizen or guest of feasts, but rather an impoverished aristocrat expelled or forced to escape from his own city-state, a poor man who is powerless, deprived of his dynamis, of his authority, simultaneously despised, embittered, and full of revenge. As I believe the strategy of self-dramatization and self-depreciation clearly shows the institutional background of this poetic tradition. Just like the archetypal poor man who has no access, ute gar eis agoren, ute dicas, he cannot enter the main square or even the court buildings, as the fate of those who are poor is illustrated by the elegy that I placed on the slide. Also, the Theognidian tradition, as I mentioned, was the subject of the process of transmission outside the institutional civic order. So it wasn't the officially protected literature, according to the Rossi's distinction, but rather a tradition that we should associate with private and grassroots initiatives. And this, in turn, brings the issue of textual transmission closer to the thread of politics and ideology. By the same, I propose to replace the Rossi's opposition from which I started, la letteratura ufficialmente protetta, non protetta, by the well-established model of the tension between two ideologies of polis and anti-polis proposed by Ian Morris and Leslie Kirk. Practices of preserving the tradition of Theognis are linking up, of course, with the second one. I mean, with the ideology of conservative anti-democratic circles. More recently, also, Mirko Canevaro has applied and advanced this approach, contrasting the authorized popular culture of the Athenian institutions with unofficial cultural expressions related to the aristocratic outlook. So this unauthorized elite culture in classical Athens, as Canevaro shows on the basis of inter alia Aristophanes wasps, was often produced in informal context, namely at the symposium of a hetaireia, which constituted, as he writes, probably the most suitable occasion for expressing anti-democratic views, end of quote. Finally, we saw during the reading of Professor Manuela Giordano that the elegies carved on the herms were also a platform for the ideology of the polis, which also explained why the aristocrats of Alcibiades and Critias circle focused on them with their angry towards the institutions of polis. Therefore, I believe that we can combine it all into a fairly coherent picture of the memory conflict between democrats and anti-democratic circles. And now the last context I want to highlight. As many studies have shown in recent years, at the turn of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, music has become a symbolic instrument of manifesting one's own political beliefs and identity. So due to the professionalization of poetry and music caused, among others, by development of public festivals, composers and performers introduced a number of innovations. The existing stage conventions, collectively referred as new music, they began to use new formal solutions, including new scales and costumes, new instruments, mixing genres, and so on, and treat the poetic performance itself with greater ease. In the political discourse of aristocratic circles, anti-polis ideology, this new phenomena were contrasted with the old tradition as its aberration, harmful especially to young audiences who, as Plato claims in many dialogues, need contact with the prudent and ordered muse based on classical scales and solutions. Moreover, testimonies about the leading figures of the aristocratic circles, for example, about Critias, often emphasize the need for preserving the old and classical symbolic and poetic culture. According to Lysias, Critias, during the regime of the 30 tyrants which he headed, strove to purge the city of unjust men and the rest of the citizens to virtue and justice, eparetenkai, dikaiosyne. one of the instruments of this moral renewal and the point of reference for cultural policy of this oligarchic movement was the wisdom of the old poetic traditions. I believe that also the opinions about theognis that I mentioned before perfectly fit into this conservative discourse. For example, Isocrates complains about the lack of public attention in the theognis teaching, or some of the Xenophon's conclusion of the nature of the Theognidian elegies, in his view, concentrated solely on the topic of virtue, arete. So both of these testimonies reflect the symbolic rule of the theognis tradition for the aristocracy of the classical age, as well as the special temporality of aristocratic ideology, which used to privilege the old times and past forms of culture, simultaneously showing aversion to what is new. And that is the context in which I propose to interpret the uprising and the transmission of the corpus theognidium, both as a manifestation of the aristocracy's special concern for the preservation of the aristocratic culture, and the result of an elitist cultural and mnemonic practice of supporting and transmitting this theognidian tradition, as the effect of practices specific to the closed male hetairia, as the result of efforts to consolidate the entire tradition and to prevent it from passing into oblivion, at the same time as an effect of cooperation within the mnemonic community of aristocrats hostile to democratic values and institutions and immersed in nostalgia for the times when the aristocracy enjoyed a position of dominance in polis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this very interesting talk. Any questions or comments? Suggestions? Okay. So thank you very much, Jan, for this.
Thank you.
Hope to see you sometime in the next Orality in Literacy. Perhaps you'll be able to come in person.
I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
If we have 2 minutes, I would like to point out that the perspective I have chosen owes a lot to the book by Theodore Hadji-Mitchell, which I believe is an excellent example of the application of a sociological model to research on cultural memory practices and the transmission of poetry in archaic Greece. And I would like also to emphasize that the research perspective outlined in this way fits into a broader trend regarding memory studies, a trend related to the growing awareness of the importance of the material means of memory transmission, a shift which I could describe using the article of Jeffrey Olick and Joyce Robbins, which was a great inspiration for me as a shift from collective memory to the historical sociology of particular mnemonic practices. And if someone would like to read my handout, please send me an email. Thank you.
We didn't receive it.
Once again, sorry.
Did you send your handout?
Yes, I have sent it. I have sent it to Professor Donna Shalev, who promised me to publish it.
Okay, so
it's on the website. That's why I'm asking about it.
We'll put it on the website
Okay,
soon.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.